you're forced in a position where you go to a school and you have people around you and you need to, sink or swim. So I was definitely, I had some friends growing up. I did experience a lot of bullying through school, but it was just a constant feeling of being out of place and not understanding why, and always feeling uncomfortable, whether it was kind of in my clothing or whether it was, who I was needed to hang out with, or the types of behaviors I was expected to perform, whether that was playing sport or whether it was acting in a certain way with my body. And when I hit puberty was when I really started to kind of think about who I was attracted to.
Mm. Hello everyone, welcome to Humans with Luke McCredden. I'm Luke McCredden. That voice you just heard was Archie Boulter. Archie is a dear friend of mine and an amazing human. Archie's just embarked recently on setting up Queertown, an online hub, a central platform in which they can host from their queer content, music, podcasts, articles, you name it. It's all there on Queertown. Somewhere where queer people all across Australia can get together and share in the fun. But as we discussed in this podcast, which was an amazing chat, I think it's worth having a look at Queertown, regardless of where you're from, your background, any of that. We as a nation have a long, long way to go. We've got a lot to learn, and hopefully we share some of that in this podcast. So anyway, I hope you enjoy it. It was a lot of fun. Episode 4, Archie Boulter. Archie.
Hey.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. I really am.
Well, it's a privilege to be here, and I'm very excited about this podcast. So I'm very, very pleased to be a part of it.
I've been looking forward to this one. We've talked about it for a while.
We have.
But I want to jump straight in and talk about Queertown. It's something that you've really taken on recently, and I love I love following it. Mm-hmm. But let's put it out there and tell people what it is and what it's about, I suppose.
Cool. Okay. Well, Queertown is a social enterprise startup that I have co-founded. So we've been around for a bit over 6 months now, so we're pretty new to the game. But essentially, Queertown is an online destination packed full of Australian LGBTIQA+ digital media designed by queer people for queer people. So we're talking videos and podcasts and writing and artwork. And we're trying to fill a huge gap in Australian digital media by producing Australian-based content that's really positive and uplifting. And so we're trying to create a platform, a one-stop shop where someone can come and access heaps of great content in one spot.
So there's nothing like that previously, and it's something obviously that people are wanting. Yeah,
most of the time people are like, surely that already exists, but it just doesn't. Yeah. Anywhere around the world, we haven't been able to find anything similar to Queertown. There's obviously like great queer podcasts or like a great YouTube series, but nothing that brings it all to one place. And typically the queer content we have access to is most often US based, or it's about someone's coming out story, or it's, pitched at non-queer people to educate them, as opposed to having really great content for queer people. So that's what we're doing. We're producing original content, and we're also curating existing content to make it really easy to access.
Yeah, and it is just a case of going on to a website and it's all housed there, I suppose?
Yeah, we're starting small. We're trying to start simple by just having a website that you can go to, queertown.com.au, and then down the track we'll be developing an app just to make it even more accessible for people, because it's a really exciting opportunity, particularly for people living rural or regionally, to be able to access representation and community, because it's pretty hard for a queer person out in the country to, access these things. So an app would make it even more accessible.
Totally. What's the feedback been like? Have you had much feedback so far?
Yeah, a lot of people through our market research have just been really excited.
Yeah.
And actually market research has been quite difficult because you want it to be really specific and you want specific information from people, but everyone's just kind of been like, anything, give us anything, whatever the content is, we don't care. If it's queer, it's Australian, we will consume it, which is, it's a good problem to have.
Yeah.
So people are excited about it. We're doing a soft launch later this year, but in the meantime, we're just kind of uploading some behind the scenes content and that kind of thing. So the reaction's been great. We've been building traction online. We've I think, we're up to about 4,000 followers or 3,000 followers or something in a number of months. So people are getting excited about it, which is great.
And it's just about getting it out there, because I'm sure there'll be many more tens of thousands of followers to come.
Fingers crossed.
Well, while we're doing it, let's do the plug. Like, it's across Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Yeah. I'm not sure if is it Twitter?
Yeah, Twitter's a scary place for us. We are on Twitter, but don't ask us how we use it because we're still not even sure. But yeah, and in terms of Instagram, you can find us at queer.town. You can search Queertown on Facebook. You can find us at queertown.com.au. Subscribe for updates and for our first content drops. But yeah, we share all types of great content. And even though we're designing this for queer people, whether you're queer or you're not queer, you can get a lot out of the experience and a lot out of the page. So highly recommend checking it out.
I love it. I follow it. I love it's always a colourful post, but there's also the videos that you guys do, which always make me smile, which is why we're good friends, but it's also why I wanted you on the podcast, because it's all about, for me, people that I enjoy, make me happy. So I'd certainly urge anyone to jump on there and have a look, because it's fun. You must have fun doing it. It looks like you're having fun.
Yeah, we do have a lot of fun. We kind of like pinch ourselves, even though it's a lot of hard work.
Sure.
And we don't have the revenue just yet to kind of really back us up. So it's a lot of hustling, but at the same time, we like pinch ourselves because we're creating our dream jobs at the moment. My co-founder Grace and myself. And we've got a couple of volunteers on board who are kind of helping and supporting us, and people who are putting their hands up to get involved. So it is really dreamy, and the privilege of actually creating a space that other queer people are coming to and engaging with, and we've met so many cool people. It just feels like we're in the right place at the right time doing something.
This is a two-part question. Why hasn't this been done before, and why are you doing it personally?
I don't know why it hasn't been done before. It's a big question. I think it could come down to like opportunities. It could come down to like society's kind of restrictions and norms. Like, it's a really big question. I think
it's also a lot of effort. Like, it's not. Aside from everything, it's you guys put in some serious time and money, and
And the reality is typically these types of organisations are not for profit. Yep. We at Queertown, we are building a for-profit social enterprise. It's important to us that we do build a large, scalable, profitable business. We can create jobs for people. We can pay people that we engage with. And I think sometimes it can be disheartening or daunting to look around the space and say, I want to create something, but you're looking at people who are really struggling and they're, living grant by grant, or, they're trying to fundraise, and, they're a charity and they do great work, but it's really, really hard. And most often you see that people might sign up or start an idea because they want to be creative or they want to create a space, and they actually don't get to do that work. They're just doing admin and emails and so I think people might start and burn out, or they might not feel like it's possible. But for us, for myself at least, before Grace came on board as a co-founder, I was just really passionate about digital media, because for me, as myself being queer, like, digital media was my first opportunity to explore my own identity and to connect with people from my community, because I grew up out in the suburbs and there was no queer community around me that I could access. So digital media has always had like a really special place in my heart, because it's provided access and representation. And then growing up, I'd just always been aware that I wanted to start my own business as opposed to work for someone else. And then, about 12 months ago, I finally had an epiphany. I'd been playing with an idea of maybe a YouTube channel or a podcast or writing. And then I thought, well, why not have a place where you have all of this content and it's coming from lots of different people? And 48 hours later, I'd quit my full-time job, which was an amazing job, but I just knew as soon as I had that epiphany that is exactly what I needed to do. And since then, I've just been working on it, and Grace came on board about 6 months ago. And I think for a lot of people, when they start out in business, it's mostly just hurdles and lots of closed doors. And we've been lucky that we've actually had a lot of doors open and a lot of yeses. And I think that's really given us a lot of momentum at the start. And I think that's why we've just kind of kept going, kept growing. Even though it's hard, we're excited about it. So I think having that support and validation has really helped as well.
Yeah. And what about initial funding? obviously you've done a couple of programs, we've done well, and you've had some backing and all that sort of thing. Is it, like you mentioned before, is it constantly at the moment? Are you still chasing it just to keep things going at the moment before you start actually, earning something out of it?
Yes,
financially, so to speak.
Yeah, and I mean, anyone who's started like a business, I'm sure, can like empathize. It's a tough gig. We did get some seed funding through an accelerator program that we were part of, which was an awesome opportunity.
Yeah.
And we've done a little bit of like crowdfunding.
Yep.
We've been applying for different grants, and but yeah, it's a lot of work. We're essentially just testing different potential revenue streams through running workshops or doing production for people.
Yep.
And we haven't found the perfect solution just yet. So we just got to keep working and find.
So young, it's so young, the project, So there's so far it can go. I think it's great.
Thank you.
So the main thing for you was based on a personal experience or personal feelings about how important the space is, that media digital space is. Hence why you've doing it. Have you had that feedback from people that sort of mirrored how you felt growing up to now as well?
Definitely. I think representation, in quotation marks, is sort of thrown around as a buzzword so much that sometimes we don't really process the kind of depth or the importance or the meaning behind it. And I think unless you've really experienced a lack of representation, you kind of really take for granted that all the images around you are made for you. And, I mean, for myself as a white person, I'm hyper aware that most advertising and media is pitched towards me, and nearly everyone is white in content. But at the same time, nearly everyone is straight, and nearly everyone is cisgender. So for myself as someone who's queer and non-binary, it wasn't until recent years that I finally figured out what that meant for me, because growing up, it wasn't even on the table as a possibility to be gender diverse, for example. And it wasn't until I had the privilege of, receiving a tertiary education and took a gender studies subject at the University of Melbourne, which is a very privileged, prestigious space, and I was able to access this information that told me that A, gender diversity existed, and B, that it was a possible way that you could live and express yourself. So I didn't get that until I was in my early 20s. And growing up, I was just constantly confused, constantly uncomfortable, and I just didn't understand why. And I think it's because I didn't have any examples around me of someone who was living a non-binary or a gender diverse existence. And I think to myself, the power that Queertown has, or digital media has, to provide these types of images and stories and representation so that someone who's young can see that that's a possibility. Yeah. And they don't have to go through decades of struggle. They can start exploring and expressing themselves early.
So where was your head at in your early 20s when you discovered that was all possible, and it opened up a bit of a different world to you? Was it kind of a relief? And I don't know if I'm speaking out of tongue, but how was that feeling? Because there must be more than hundreds of thousands of people that go through those different stages of emotion, and we'll talk a bit about some of them. But that point, what was that like?
Well, I remember very specifically the exact moment where I kind of heard this terminology. Like, obviously, the term LGBT had been around for a while, although we did not understand or speak about the T, transgender, in a way that we do now. Public discourse was very different and much more limited. But I think when I was at uni, I was taking this gender studies class because I was interested in sexuality and identity. And one of our first lessons was on trans and gender diversity. And I remember being in this big lecture theatre. There were hundreds of students. We had the lecturer in front of us going through the information, going through a PowerPoint. It was very standard. And when they started talking about transgender experience, I just remember like everything else went blurry, and it was just like Zoom tunnel vision on the lecturer, and just like a real true epiphany moment where I was like, I don't know if I can swear on this.
Yeah, totally.
Like, holy shit. Like that, something just clicked inside of me, and I was like, that explains why I felt so uncomfortable. So that was an incredible relief. It was very emotional and very overwhelming. And I remember like things just felt like they were
Did it take a bit to sink in though? Because that was just the first time that you were exposed to it.
Definitely. It definitely took a long time to kind of sink in and process.
Yeah.
But just that initial exposure and like that feeling of potential and feeling seen and understood was, a really big moment for me. And then what followed was a really difficult few years. I was in a long-term relationship at the time that I decided to end because I really needed room to kind of explore myself. And I spent, like 2.5 years just like soul searching and doing a lot of research. Like when I first learnt properly around transgender experience, I just became obsessed and was, doing lots of reading, watching lots of interviews, following transgender people that I could find online. Not like I wasn't stalking these people. and just learning. And I did at first assume, I was like, oh, I must be a transgender woman because that explains why growing up I never identified with the boys and what I was expected to do and being masculine, and I always felt out of place, and I always wanted to be with the girls, and I loved the kind of female rituals that I would see and could never be a part of. And it took a long time to figure out that that wasn't me either. I wasn't a transgender woman, but I also wasn't a cisgender male. And so what was so confusing is that it was a real grey area. And society doesn't really make much room for the grey area, and there's not much explanation for what that grey area could be. So you kind of you're forced to do a lot of soul searching, and I had really, really low points. I really tried to find counselling and psychologists, and no one could help me. People didn't understand it. They were diagnosing me as things like intersex, which is totally, totally different.
What's that?
So intersex is related to sex as opposed to gender. So it's someone who is born and may not be able to be categorized as strictly male or strictly female, whether that's based on genitalia or sexual organs or chromosomes or hormones. So there's about 70 to 80 different intersex variations.
Right.
But it's very different to gender.
Yep.
So people just didn't get it.
Yep.
So that's why I had to do so much work. And now I'm at a point where I know myself so well and I feel so much more confident and self-assured in a way that I never would have, I don't think, if I hadn't been forced to go through that. So I see it as a real blessing now and a real superpower. But going through that was really, really hard. Yeah,
I bet. So you unable to find people to talk to help you. Is that changing? Are there more people? Because obviously there'd still be kids or guys in their early 20s or 30s or 40s who are still probably having those confusing moments, no doubt. Are there more people now that sort of are more, I suppose, out there that you could go and find fairly easily to talk to and maybe get some clarity on, not someone to tell you who you are or what you are, but just to, bring some clarity to the way things are and here's some ideas about what you might be going through?
Like I would say logistically, yes, there are like more resources accessible. There's more information online, which is only a positive thing. But I definitely wouldn't say that it's easy. And, as scientists are now saying that I think by the age of 4, a human being has a real understanding of their own gender identity. And so we're talking about children here who are growing up in families, and if those families aren't equipped to understand how to raise a child who may be gender diverse or may be trans or may be queer in some way or other, then that's going to be a really challenging situation for that young person. So it's hard as a young person because that is when you're going through these kind of identity experiences and journeys. And so if your family isn't supportive or doesn't understand that, that's obviously typically your first port of call. So that can be a huge barrier. It's pretty intimidating as a young person to go to a doctor and speak about it or, to find the right resources that you need. And, that's compounded if you're living out in rural or regional Australia and it's a small community. So I'd say it's still really hard, but yes, there's definitely more services. And the fact that, more people are having conversations around being transgender, for example, goes to show that there's a bit more awareness in society. So that's positive.
What was your as a young kid, what were did you go through phases up until say that 20 or early 20s when you're talking about there were different stages of confusion or you weren't sure about yourself? You mentioned about, you didn't want to necessarily play with the boys like the stereotypical boys do. Were there just different moments throughout, or from an early age, were you aware of who you were?
It's really interesting to reflect on now that I kind of have an awareness of gender diversity and my own kind of identity to be able to understand my experience growing up. And I would say it was more just an ongoing awareness and feeling of discomfort and being misplaced and not understanding why. So, like, although I think sometimes my parents or family members may feel surprised because, they saw someone who, did thrive and did have friends and that kind of thing. But that's also because you're socialized in a way to have friends and to, you're forced in a position where you go to a school and you have people around you and you need to, sink or swim. So I was definitely, I had some friends growing up. I did experience a lot of bullying through school, but it was just a constant feeling of being out of place and not understanding why, and always feeling uncomfortable, whether it was kind of in my clothing or whether it was, who I was needed to hang out with, or the types of behaviors I was expected to perform, whether that was playing sport or whether it was acting in a certain way with my body. And when I hit puberty was when I really started to kind of think about who I was attracted to. I don't know, for some people it's much younger. And that was when I was like, I'm more attracted to guys than I am to girls. And so for me, I was like, that must mean that I'm a gay man. And so I put everything down to that. I was like, that explains why I'm more sensitive, why I'm more emotional, why I'm more feminine, why I'm more uncomfortable around. So
you just threw
people.
All of that into that basket.
Yes.
So that you obviously were aware of the different sexualities.
Yes.
So you straight away distinguished, I must be gay, and everything else, that's what that means.
Yes.
Right.
So like around, early
It's not that black
school.
and white, is it?
No. No, exactly. So throughout high school, I kind of identified as gay, and I came out in kind of later years and had a lot of challenges with that. But it was probably when I left school that I was became really hyper aware of the fact that just wasn't quite everything.
Just it, yeah.
It wasn't just coming down to who I was attracted to, it was how I felt inside and how I was expressing myself, and really importantly, how others were seeing me. And I mean, one example.
How could you distinguish how people were seeing you? Was it just a perception, or did you have a strong feeling that people were seeing you differently?
I suppose it was, I was aware that people weren't seeing the version of me that I felt inside.
Right.
They were seeing the boy and, they were seeing what they expected me to be. And I think something that I reflect on now that I couldn't articulate at the time was my discomfort around my birth name. And growing up, I always felt a bit uncomfortable with it. Throughout high school, I would always use different nicknames and ask people to call me different nicknames. And in the end, I was just going by my initials. And I then started exploring kind of a little bit of drag and more so gender bending. It wasn't a character. It was just like an opportunity to express different parts of my gender. So I might go out at night with some friends in like makeup and wigs and heels. And I chose the name Archie Bold, as in Archibald, because I felt that it was a bit androgynous. Something drew me to the name Archie. And so I started to play with that a little bit, and like very quickly realized that I was most comfortable as myself when I was dressed up as Archie Bold. And I realized that when I would get home at night and had to take my, in quotation marks, drag off, that actually kind of felt like putting drag on when I was going back to this other person that everyone expected me to be. So in the end, I stuck with that name and asked people to start calling me that name, and went through a legal name change. And so for me, reflecting on that, I feel that the reason I was uncomfortable with that birth name was that it was associated with that person that I was pretending to be or trying to be, that didn't feel comfortable with. Everyone named that person with that name, and that's why I felt I needed to change that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
What was that conversation like with your family?
I was, quite lucky in that my family was supportive.
Yeah.
And I say lucky not because, I think every family should be supportive, but I know that for some people they don't have that support. I was worried that my parents would be offended that I would, disregard the name that they had bestowed upon me. But yeah, they were really supportive. And I think what was incredibly validating, and if there are any parents listening or family members or friends, it was such a positive experience for me because my family said that makes a lot of sense to us. Like, we actually really get it. And I know going into that conversation, they had some suspicions and they felt a bit uncomfortable. They didn't know where it was going. But when I explained this is how I feel and this is why I'm choosing the name Archie, they were like, that makes so much sense. And that was just really validating. It didn't feel like I had to prove or justify it.
Yeah, that's
so they've
great.
been supportive. And there's still mistakes every now and then. There's still hiccups. People might revert to the old name just out of habit. And that takes time, and it can be a painful and really uncomfortable process. But you also have to be patient and understand that everyone has to figure it out around you as well.
Absolutely. That's cool. What's for you growing up? And you're not old, so it's not you can reflect back in my day. But to what you sort of see now, has Australia changed much just in, let's just say, 20 years, just for the sake of it?
Mm. Oh, shit, yeah.
Because I feel like it has in that space, for a couple of obvious reasons, but just in general, one of the reasons I feel like there's a change and a bit of a swing is when you hear things that are said now that are offensive now that maybe in 50 years ago were just rolled off the tongue of a lot of people. It's awkward. It's awkward as fuck to hear some of that stuff now, and it makes me cringe. And I've never been. I mean, that's always felt awkward to me hearing people use offensive words to anyone. But I think the fact now that there's I feel like there's a whole lot of people now that go, oh, like, did that person just say that? Do you know what I mean? Because the fact that it's now sounding really odd and really stands out as being something that's an ugly thing to say is kind of a sign that we're going in the right direction.
Yes, I think we are going in the right direction. I think, like, before reflecting on the past few decades, I think it's important to note that geographically, it depends where you are in Australia. Like in metropolitan Australia, it's much more progressive. Whereas if you're living in the country or regionally, like, there is still a lot of difficulties and challenges and a lot of slurs that are still used, and that's almost the norm. And I would say that even though typically we see in metropolitan Australia that's the case, that it's more progressive, there's still like a lot of people who are abused and assaulted and victimized. So I think, yes, it's improving. And I've been doing a lot of research around the kind of 60s and 70s and 80s. And it's been a really humbling process because I think sometimes as an impatient millennial, it's like, we want rights, we want them now. And that hasn't changed for me. But to see that, in the 70s, it was still illegal to be a gay man. People were being charged as sex offenders, people were being thrown in prison up to 20 years. Before that, people were being killed purely on being, in this case, a gay man. Shows to me how much progress we've made because people are still walking around the street. I work with someone who lived through all of that. So that to me shows how much progress we've made. But yeah, we've still got a really, really long way to go. And I would say the biggest tipping point for me is the kind of expectation on people outside the community to become well-versed and to understand these types of life experiences. So like allies, for example, I feel are the key to our next steps forward as a community because we need people in positions of power within systems and institutions to like back us up and support us. We've been rallying for decades. So to have more and more people in the public and the mainstream aware of kind of our day-to-day issues is really positive. But yeah, we've got a long way to go.
Oh, and totally.
There's like a lot of emphasis put on like same-sex marriage coming through and things like that, which is like, I try to appreciate that that's a great opportunity for some, but also like that is such a fraction. Like we're talking about, a same-sex couple who wants to engage in a long-term monogamous relationship and have that acknowledged with a marriage certificate. Like that in itself is niche within the queer community. So to say that everything's solved now, but intersex people, they're still performing operations on intersex babies. Trans people are still fighting for their rights just to get their name changed and to, be recognised on their birth certificate for the gender that they identify as. And, there's so much more than just same-sex marriage.
Sure. But even on that, why do you think there was so much, even though that is just a minor or a small part of the whole piece, why would there have been so much hesitation in your mind? Because it felt like there was hesitation in just making that happen, just for someone to say, yep, okay, this is all good, this is legal.
Do you mean as in people hesitating to approve it?
Yeah.
God, well, it's also worth noting that we only just got it across the line. I think it was something like 63% or something. So there's still a significant portion of Australia that said we do not want this. So I walked down the street thinking, great, we got 6 out of 10 people, but what about the other 4?
Yeah.
So that in itself is concerning. I mean, the whole thing was a bit of a sham in that it was optional to vote. It's the first time Australia has ever had the opportunity to vote on someone's rights in that way. It was done with snail mail. The whole thing was really bizarre. Yeah. And in terms of why people are hesitant, I think because we live in a heteronormative society that's been set up in a way that some people really benefit from and are comfortable with because they aren't part of the queer community. So they've grown up feeling that this is the way things should be. You kind of grow up as either a man or a woman, you marry the opposite sex, you have a long-term relationship, you have a family, and that's what's natural.
People are happy with the norm, aren't they?
Yeah. And there's so many misconceptions that introducing things like rights for queer people is going to impede on other people's rights, where really we're just creating a more accepting and more accessible society.
Yeah. It's so, I mean, I feel I love talking to you about it, and we should note that we are friends outside of this, so we know each other quite well. I love talking to you about this because I feel educated every time I speak to you, because there's so much that it's understandable. Do you have the understanding of, as in, can you understand why there's lack of education just for the general public in a lot of what you know? Because it's not necessarily out. I don't know a hell of a lot about it. So that's why I love having the opportunity to chat to you whenever we catch up, because it's very it's it's not the same thing, but going through the process of learning about autism, and my daughter's got autism, it's something that I would never ever know anything about until I went through it all, and trying to explain it to people is very difficult, and I don't expect people to understand it straight off the bat. So a lot of the times, unless you're looking for things to learn about, it's sometimes hard. Is that a frustration of yours when you're just sort of not necessarily campaigning or anything, but just in general day to day? That must be, it must be difficult just to get anything sort of explained clear in layman's terms, I guess you'll call it.
Yeah, I mean, me and a lot of my queer friends and co-workers have been talking a lot about exhaustion because it is really exhausting. It's kind of like you're coming out to every single new person that you meet, even if you're just through expressing yourself authentically, you know and you're aware that this person is judging you, and you don't know what their history is, what their background is, what their beliefs are. And so whether you're explaining it verbally, whether it's just through being yourself, you're constantly under scrutiny and judgment. So that is really tiring and it is frustrating. But I understand, as you're saying, if someone doesn't feel directly impacted by it, they're less likely to do the work to go and learn about it, which I understand. Yeah. But at the same time, it means that it's, conservative estimates say that there's about 11% of the population is LGBTIQA+. I would say it's significantly higher. But
how much higher?
Well, we're seeing...
If you had to put a number on it.
I don't know that I would put a number on it necessarily, but we're seeing through research that more and more and more and more young people are identifying as either gender diverse or bisexual or pansexual, which is similar to bisexual. And I don't think that's because it's a phase or a Gen X thing or it's something in the water. It's because people are seeing more possibilities through access to information, through social media. They're like, oh, this is actually an opportunity. I can express myself in this way, or I can explore my sexuality in ways that historically wasn't even an option. So I think people who think it doesn't directly impact them are fools, because, whether it's your colleague, whether it's your friends, whether it's your family, you're constantly engaging with, whether it's a stranger on the street. So
do you feel like Queertown is one of those platforms that people will maybe be drawn to but haven't necessarily yet discovered themselves fully, and then there's information, I dare say, within what you're doing that might help people? They'll read it or listen to it and go, this makes sense.
I hope so. I mean, our biggest hope is that people can access our content and it gives them an opportunity to feel seen and feel heard and explore their identity and maybe have those epiphany moments that I was talking about earlier. So that is our audience, but I do hope that people outside the community will stumble across our content as well and get something from it. And to answer your question before, I think the reason why people aren't exposed to this is because the government is terrified to incorporate queer content into the education system. And if we had young people learning about this at an early age, it would be a huge game changer. And for some bizarro reason, conservatives believe that even exposing young people to this terminology will somehow induct them into the queer community or change their brains. That's just, scientifically, that just doesn't even make sense.
That's concerning, that the powers that be think like that. Do you know what I mean? Well, that's just so concerning and so, it's so disgusting that people would think along those lines.
The powers that be, and historically, are kind of straight, white, cis men, and there are lots of great straight, white, cis men out there, but there are also a lot of shitty ones who, through what we've spoken about, haven't been exposed to that lived experience and therefore have a lack of empathy and a lack of understanding. And that's how our society has been built by those people. So it serves those people very well, which is why those people are so hesitant for change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's disturbing is what it is. We've spoken a bit about the current climate. If there was, and this is a bit of a question without notice, maybe I should have given you some. If there were a couple of things, and I'll open it to a couple of things because I'm sure there'll be more than one, that you could put in place that go into the education system, for example, what jumps out at you that you would love to just have in there for that education?
I mean, the biggest thing is just language and terminology. I could imagine if people in primary school were able to learn about different identities, and it doesn't just have to be LGBTIQA+ specific. We're just talking about diversity and intersectionality in humans. If we were to learn about what it means to be gay, what it means to be lesbian, what it means to be trans, it's not putting a value judgment on it. It's not saying this is a good thing or this is a bad thing. It's just talking about different types of people that are out there, and that early exposure and normalizing of these different lived experiences, I think, would just be a huge game changer. It would take out a lot of the fear. It would take out a lot of ignorance. It would take out a lot of kind of isolation and self-hatred, mental health problems, associated with feeling isolated. I feel like what we're talking about is just education, exposure, and empathy. So if they can just be introduced to different people or learn some words and terminology, I think it could be as simple as that.
And then the ability for the students, or whether it's primary school, secondary school, even through universities, to have that in front of them, but also then to have, somewhere to take it themselves if they want to and learn more. It's just opening the door, isn't it?
Yeah, I just don't understand why our education system is the way it is. It feels so 1950s that people are in strict uniforms, people have to present in a certain way, people have to, it's I just feel like, yes, we need to educate our young people and they need to have lots of opportunities to learn great things, but why aren't we teaching them to express themselves authentically? There's
some, and I know there's a lot of schools that do it differently, but there's some bizarre things that get put across the kids' faces in a classroom, and you just go, yeah, it's 2019.
Yeah,
we're changing rapidly in the way we communicate, the way we, technology itself, the way we operate. We don't need this anymore.
I wish I'd learned how to do my taxes.
Yeah.
I wish I got life experience, not learning how to divide the angles of a triangle. Why didn't I learn how to do my taxes?
When was the last time you used angles of triangles in algebra?
in school, and I hated it.
But what the fuck is that for?
I don't know. I'm like, just teach us about people, teach us about the real world.
People would be, race, sexuality, all that would be just so much more beneficial.
I know.
Yeah, I know.
And
I'm not telling you.
No,
don't yell at me.
No, I'm just like frustrated thinking about.
It is frustrating to think about.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
So I feel like people are going to be listening to this and hopefully like cheering as they listen to it.
Hopefully.
Or they might be like, what are you talking about?
That's okay, because it might make them read something else or jump onto the Queertown website. But I'd like to think that there was even things that could come into the system soon where you could teach kids about how brains are different. Not everyone's brain's the same, anything to do with humans. We're all different. There's so many different. Teachers even struggle sometimes with students, and generally they're older. And I'm not trying to be ageist or anything like that, but one thing we find, and again with learning more about autism, kids struggle, and there's some schools that do not help these kids at all, and they need, they might not necessarily need a teacher's aide next to them all day, but they sometimes will need somewhere to go when the rest of the kids are playing a really loud and full-on game out at recess. I want to be a part of that. You can't push them out there to be a part of that, and that's not just autistic kids. It's just a lot of people in general. I just don't feel like they're being catered for, or there's enough catering for different kids.
Yeah, and I mean the unfortunate thing is that those kids are seen as different and othered, and it's almost like it's their error or their fault, but they're just trying to survive in a system and a structure that hasn't been built to cater to them. So, I mean, there are so many autistic people who are brilliant and so smart, so clever, emotionally intelligent, but because our education system or our society is built in an ableist way, it means that so many people don't have the potential to thrive in a way that they could.
Yeah.
And are then made to feel ashamed because they're not thriving in a way that, in a society that hasn't been built for them.
But even, don't you think, and I'm sure you do, but the education of about sexuality and about gender would actually benefit everybody, like regardless of who you are. It would actually benefit just your life and the way you think, but also professionally as you move through, especially at a primary school level when you're between 6 and 12.
It's huge. Like I conduct a lot of LGBTI inclusive training in lots of different environments, typically with people who aren't part of the community. So it's a very interesting role. And one of the main points that I try to drive home now is that learning about gender identity and sexuality, it isn't just for LGBTIQA plus people.
No.
In fact, right now I'd argue it's just as important, if not at times more important, for people who do identify as cisgender and heterosexual, because everybody is impacted by social norms. And I mean, how many older guys, straight guys, have really intense mental health problems because they've been taught growing up that they can't share emotion, they can't be sensitive, they can't open up to their friends. I worked with someone recently who he was like stereotypically a really big straight ochre Aussie guy, and he teared up in a session with me because he was like, I'm so angry that I've been robbed of having great relationships with people around me. He's like, I'm only now in my 40s starting to feel comfortable putting my arm around my male friends, because growing up I'd get called gay, I'd be made to feel ashamed for it. So I mean, that's one example. And how many women are taught to stay quiet or be sensitive or be feminine or go for a certain job, all based on their gender. So this impacts everybody.
Yeah totally. Can we, speaking of education, something that we just chatted briefly off air about. Do you want to tell us about the little badge you're wearing there? Because it's something that is fairly new to me, even when we were just chatting about it before.
I'm wearing a badge that says they/them, and it signifies the pronouns that I use. So gender pronouns is essentially a way that we refer to someone when we're not using their name. For example, we might use he, him, or she, her, or in my case, they, them. And they, them essentially is an opportunity for someone who doesn't identify as male or female to have pronouns and language that people can use that validates their gender identity. And for me, growing up, someone who was assigned male at birth, I was automatically given male pronouns. People would say he and him. And, connected with the discomfort that I spoke about earlier in terms of my name and the way people saw me, my pronouns as he and him added to that discomfort and added to this feeling of not being seen for who I really was. So as I went through a name change, I also changed my pronouns. And that is a tricky process because it does take some getting used to. And obviously they, them is quite unique in that it's typically used in a plural setting. So people get confused when you're referring to one person. It is still used as a singular pronoun. For example, if someone was to leave a bag behind and you'd say, oh, whose bag is that? And you might say, oh, it's that person, they had to rush off. You're still referring to someone as singular, but it can be confusing. So that's hard not only to get people around you to familiarize themselves with that pronoun, but also I experience daily constantly being misgendered, people constantly using the wrong pronouns, someone who I haven't met before. And when you go through the process of changing your pronouns, you become even more hyper aware of how gendered everything is because now I'm very sensitive to it and I'm like, oh, you're reading me, you're assuming my gender. And, I'm like, how dare you assume my gender? You don't know me. I'm like, I haven't even spoken to you before. I don't even know you. But because of the way society is set up, you're assuming that I'm male and therefore you have put these pronouns on me that aren't even my pronouns. So, yeah, I would say there's a big shift now. There are more and more people using they, them pronouns. And a good story I heard the other day was one of my friends' younger brothers. I think they're a teenager. Their mum was talking about they, them pronouns and how confusing it is. And this, teenage boy was like, Mum, catch up. Language has been changing for centuries. Language is constantly changing. And, we always look to young people for wisdom. Yeah. And he was right. Language is changing. And it's true. It's confusing. It takes work. But sometimes you just have to do the confusing work.
Yeah. I was gonna ask you about growing up queer in Australia, but I've actually changed my mind. I want to know what it's like as an adult in Australia as a queer person.
Good question. Refreshing question. I would say it's a real mixed bag. I would say it's empowering on one half, on one side, because I have the independence to express myself how I want, to move through the world in a way that I want, in a way that I couldn't when I was younger. So I'd say that independence is positive and empowering, and also with age comes wisdom, and I've been able to access more information and more learning and meet more people and have more diverse people come into my life. Growing up, you're kind of restricted to your community, your town, your family circles, and I love my family, but not very diverse circles. So getting out into the real world and meeting people has been really positive. But I would say that for myself, being queer as an adult, it's still incredibly challenging because I'm living in a society that hasn't been built for people like me. And I don't feel to this day that I'm able to express myself authentically for my own safety. I've had countless negative experiences, whether I've been verbally abused, physically abused by strangers in the street, when I've gone down the street in a way that feels natural to me in terms of clothing or makeup. So I have to think every single day, where are my confidence levels at? What do I feel confident enough to do today? Because I have to leave my house and walk to the train station. Who am I going to cross paths with in that time? Who am I going to be sitting with on the train? Who's going to be in the cafe where I get a coffee from? Who's going to be in my workplace today? Am I working with new people that I don't know? How am I going to get home? How late am I going to be going home? Is it going to be dark? Am I scared of the people who are going to be around? So all of that dictates how I walk, how I talk, what I wear, how I express myself. So queer people, we're so hypervigilant. We're constantly looking for threats. So I would say that even though, as we said earlier, things are improving, we're constantly scanning, we're constantly, figuring out how we move down the street.
And that's where that exhaustion you talk about.
Yes.
That's exhausting to even think about for me that you know, like
Yes.
that's what your day-to-day routine.
And you do, it is tiring, but you come to accept it as your reality. And I think when I have conversations with non-queer people around hypervigilance, having those moments and epiphanies for non-queer people to be like, oh shit, I take for granted the fact that I can just hold my partner's hand or walk down the street or introduce myself without a second thought. Whereas we're thinking they've misgendered me, they're using the wrong pronouns, they're looking at me funny, I don't know if they're aggressive. So it's constant scanning.
And that's such a problem. That's such a problem with society that anyone has to think like that.
Yeah.
Can we talk about Uber or not?
Yeah, we can talk about anything.
Because I know, speaking to you a while back, you had a run-in with Uber that made me sick to think on so many levels. Like when you actually unpack it, can we talk about that? Because I just feel like it's just one of those things that I'm sure anyone who hears it will just go, that's fucked. If I can use that word for it.
Yeah, definitely. It was very fucked. I mean, it's one of many examples.
Sure.
And yeah, it was a little while ago. Actually, yeah, the reason it was so unfortunate is that it was a huge celebration for Queertown specifically. We'd found out that we got into this 3-month business accelerator run by Creative Victoria, and it was a night to go out with my co-founder and just celebrate. And so we went out, we had some drinks, we went out and danced and had a really fun, positive night. And then I needed to get home. So classic Melburnian, called an Uber, was chatting to this person, and I must admit, like when I'm in an Uber personally, I don't know about you, but I just like to sit in silence. But, you know, I was making a real effort to be chatty. I never want to be rude. And he started engaging. So I was like, oh, you know, I'll have a chat with this person. Anyway, so we'd been in a car for maybe like 15 minutes at that point, and he was really friendly, and, you know, we were just talking. And then he was talking about the challenges he has as an Uber driver, having to deal with all kinds of different people. And often I hear they have trouble with drunk people, so I was just assumed that's where it was going.
Yep.
And he said, you know, have to deal with drunk people, have to deal with poofs, have to deal with this, that and the other. And I was kind of just nodding along and agreeing, and then I realised what he'd said, and I was like, wait, did you say poofs? And he was like, yeah, I have to deal with so many poofs. And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, oh, you know what a poof is, someone who's not normal. They were his words. And I was essentially paraphrasing, was like, oh, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with being a poof. And he said, are you a poof? And I said, yes, I am a poof. And so he started shouting and ranting, and he was referencing the Bible, and he was talking about Jesus and how disrespectful gay people are. And, you know, I'm in a moving vehicle with this stranger. I'm in his car. And so like I wasn't processing what he was saying. I was just like, I need to get out. And thankfully we eventually came to a red light. And so I was just trying to open the door, and it was locked. So I had to figure out how to unlock the door while this man was shouting at me. And I just got out and I just started running away from the car, and immediately was going to Uber and reporting this person. So, I mean, I was in the middle of nowhere on a highway in the middle of the night, and was kind of left there. Had to get another Uber, but obviously didn't want to get the same person. So I had to, you know, be out in the cold waiting to order a new one. So, I mean, that was obviously a pretty stressful situation. And unfortunately, Uber was not helpful, did not follow it up, did not help me in the process, told me that there are two sides to every story. So I assume that person's still out on the road driving.
Yeah, and as I said, unpacking it, there's so many levels of it that are just not right. But I guess one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it, and if you were happy with it, was that's one experience of, I know many that you've had, but one experience of countless that people in the queer community have. So I guess I wanted, if people can hear that, and I'm sure, like I said, everyone listening, I'm sure will have the same reaction that I did, and it's just so not right. There's so many things that are just not right about that, and I like to put that out there, and I don't want you to feel uncomfortable by it, but just to show that's one example of so many, and that's why, while early on we said we're progressing a little bit here, But that's why we are so far behind the eight ball on so many levels.
Yes.
So thank you for sharing that.
No, thank you. And I agree. I think it is a good opportunity because when I share it with people who may not be so close or exposed to the queer community, they're really shocked as though like, surely that doesn't happen today. And I think unless you are a queer person experiencing that regularly, you may not realize how often that still happens. And legal reform only goes so far. That doesn't mean that everyday people on the ground are changing their values and beliefs and backgrounds.
Let's get positive again.
Okay.
Because I'm loving, I just want to talk about what's next for Queertown because it's going places. It's awesome. Again, if you've skipped some of this podcast for some reason, you're just listening now, Queertown is what Archie's all about, and he's built this fantastic platform, and you can find it on all the socials. But what's next?
Well, what's next for us is starting to launch some content. So we've been filming some behind the scenes content, which we've been chucking up so people can kind of see what we're doing. But later this year, later in 2019, we're going to be launching some content. We're launching with a subscription model. So you pay a very small monthly fee so that we can pay the queer people that we're engaging, so that we're supporting people in the queer community to keep working and making this type of media. So launching some content and growing our online following. It's really important to us that we grow a really vibrant community that wants this content. So we'll continue to grow our online following, looking to raise some revenue. So if we have any, cashed up investors listening, definitely go to queertown.com.au.
Definitely get in touch. The content you're talking about creating, is it in the form of video? You spoke a bit about like podcasts or other options out there. Have you got any one direction in mind, or is it just to keep doing what you're doing, putting it out there across the networks?
Yeah, our mediums are video, podcast, and writing. So we're producing a lot of original video content ourselves and also curating some content. So we've curated a couple of films that will be going up later this year with our launch. We've also curated some really awesome queer podcasts, and down the track we'll be looking to record our own. So I'll definitely be speaking to Luke about that.
The gear's here, mate.
Thank you.
Take it.
So yeah, a real kind of spread of content, both original and curated. And we kind of say if Netflix and Medium and Apple Podcasts had a queer baby, that would be Queertown.
Excellent. That's a good looking baby.
It's hot. It's very queer.
Hey, Archie, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for coming by. This has been so much fun. I hope people listening have enjoyed it and got taken a bit out of it, but more importantly, get the opportunity to go over to queertown.com.au and have a bit of a look. It's a lot of fun. I love all the behind the scenes videos. I can't get enough of that. That's fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a really awesome opportunity, and I'm excited to check out more of this podcast. And I did say to Luke off air, I feel like, at times perhaps this conversation got quite serious, and although there is lots of positivity and colour and vibrancy to the queer community, it's important to acknowledge that there is some serious negative stuff as well. So thank you for providing space for both. And it's been a pleasure.
Totally. Anytime. I think you need to probably come back.
Okay.
We'll do it again.
I would actually love that.
And we'll get some wine.
Yeah, can we get
I really feel like I've let you down.
Huge letdown.
You'll be a different person next time.
Very different.
Thank you, Archie.
Thanks, Luke.